all roads converge. On Julian Assange. In previous episodes we covered the crucifixion of Julian Assange and the banality of evil, as well as 3 parts of the section on modern-day heretics, looking at heretics on COVID-19, on the Holocaust, and on regime change wars. We now return to heretics on regime change wars for the final part, which looks at Ukraine. We ended episode 5 with: following Afghanistan and Iraq, more wars were waged, or at least supported, by the ever-already United States. These included Hillary Clinton's war in Libya, under Obama, which decimated the richest country in Africa, murdered and sodomized its president, and sent its people back into poverty, and many into slave markets. Then Syria, still under Obama. And Yemen. Not to mention many smaller wars in Africa. We now return to heretics on regime change wars for the final part, which looks at things we can learn from the conflict in Ukraine. In Europe, what occurred was, quote, the most blatant coup in history, unquote. This was the US-orchestrated, regime change Maidan coup in Ukraine in 2014, still under Obama. A compilation of relevant clips, published the 18th of March 2014, and including Victoria Nuland's famous FUCK the EU statement, supports the description of this event as a US-led coup. In a 7th of July 2022 video called Ukraine, A Taste of the Truth, Ray McGovern, a CIA specialist on Russia over many years, outlines the history of Russia's protests over US and NATO's lengthy and ongoing interference in Ukraine, leading up to what Russia calls its special military operation there. McGovern goes through US and NATO undertakings and treaties, breached and or abrogated by the US, over the long period since the USSR disintegrated, and the Russian Federation came into being. McGovern also points to various speeches by Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin on this topic, warnings of what was to come if the US and NATO did not back off. I include some of those warnings, not to be a Putin puppet, as Western legacy media likes to call those who draw attention to these things, but because so many in the West have never seen, or heard, these warnings, due to media censorship. Before we get to them though, I also point you to another perspective, focused on the 8 years between the Maidan coup and the Russian action, as summarized by Kim Iversen. She is reporting from an April 2022 article by Swiss Colonel Jacques Bourd. A link to a late May 2022 interview with Bourd is included in the text. Before we get to some quotes from speeches and interviews, let's first go back to 6 years before the Maidan coup, to the 1st of February 2008, and a US cable from US Ambassador William J. Burns in Moscow. It appears in the WikiLeaks cables, and is titled Nyet means Nyet, Russia's NATO enlargement redlines.
Summary. Following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's intent to seek a NATO membership action plan, or MAP, at the Bucharest summit, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and other senior officials, have reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains, quote, an emotional and neuralgic issue, unquote, for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence, or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Additionally, the GOR and experts continue to claim that Ukrainian NATO membership would have a major impact on Russia's defense industry, Russian-Ukrainian family connections, and bilateral relations generally. In Georgia, GOR fears continued instability and provocative acts in the separatist regions. End summary.
In a speech at the Valdai Club in October 2014, Only months after the US-led Maidan coup in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin explained who, in his view, runs ISIS, and why. Interestingly, in an interview with John Pilger just prior to the 2016 US presidential election, Julian Assange raised the issue of a 2014 email to Hillary Clinton from her campaign manager, on exactly that topic, but only published by WikiLeaks 2 years later. Assange points to this 2014 email as being, in his view, the most important email in the Clinton Podesta DNC collection of leaks.
What's the significance of the FBI's intervention in this last week of the US election campaign in the case against Hillary Clinton?
If you look at the history of the FBI, it has become effectively America's political police. And the FBI demonstrated with taking down the former head of the CIA over classified information given to his mistress. Almost no one was untouchable. The FBI is always trying to demonstrate that. No one can resist us. But Hillary Clinton very conspicuously resisted the FBI's investigation. Well, we've published quite a number of different sets of emails. So about 33,000 of Clinton's emails while she was Secretary of State. They come from a batch of just over 60,000 emails. In that 60,000 emails, Clinton has kept about half, 30,000, to herself, and we've published about half. And then there's the Podesta emails we've been publishing. Podesta is Hillary Clinton's primary campaign manager. So there's a thread that runs through all these emails. There is quite a lot of pay for play, as they call it, giving access in exchange for money for many different states, individuals and corporations, combined with the cover-up of the Hillary Clinton emails while she was Secretary of State, has led to an environment where the pressure on the FBI increases.
I mean, the Clinton campaign has said that Russia is behind all of this. It says that Russia has manipulated the campaign and is the source for WikiLeaks and its emails.
The Clinton camp has been able to project a kind of neo-McCarthyist hysteria that Russia is responsible for everything. Hillary Clinton stated multiple times, falsely, that 17 US intelligence agencies had assessed that Russia was the source of our publications. Okay. That's false. We can say that the Russian government is not the source, yes. WikiLeaks has been publishing for 10 years. In that 10 years, we've published 10 million documents, several thousand individual publications, several thousand different sources. And we have never got it wrong.
All the emails that give evidence of access for money and how Hillary Clinton herself benefited from this and how she is benefiting politically are quite extraordinary. I'm thinking of where the Qatari representative was given 5 minutes with Bill Clinton for $1 million check, and many other examples. Can you
12 million from Morocco.
12 million from Morocco.
For Hillary Clinton to attend.
In terms of the foreign policy of the United States, that's where, for me anyway, where the emails are most revealing, where they show the direct connection between Hillary Clinton and the foundation of jihadism, of ISIL in the Middle East. Can you talk something about that? How the emails demonstrate this connection between those who are meant to be fighting the jihadists, ISIL, are actually those who have helped create it.
There's an early 2014 email from Hillary Clinton, so not so long after she left Secretary of State, to her campaign manager, John Podesta. That email, it states that ISIS, is funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The governments of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Now, I think this is the most significant email in the whole collection. And perhaps because Saudi and Qatari money is spread all over the place, including into many media institutions. All serious analysts know, even the US government has mentioned or agreed with that some Saudi figures have been supporting ISIS, funding ISIS. But the dodge has always been that's it's just some rogue princes using their cut of the oil money to do whatever they like, but actually the government disapproves. But that email says that no, it is the governments of Saudi and the government and Qatar that have been funding ISIS.
The Saudis, the Qataris, the Moroccans, the Bahrainis, particularly the Saudis and the Qataris, are giving all this money to the Clinton Foundation, while Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State and the State Department is approving massive arms sales, particularly to Saudi Arabia.
Under Hillary Clinton, and our Clinton emails reveal significant discussion about it, the largest ever arms deal in the world was made with Saudi Arabia, more than $80 billion. In fact, during her tenure as Secretary of State, total arms exports from the United States in terms of the dollar value doubled.
And of course, the consequence of that is that this notorious terrorist jihadist group called ISIL or ISIS is created largely with money from the very people who are giving money to the Clinton Foundation.
Yes.
That's extraordinary.
What follows now are key passages from speeches given by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, since he is the key heretic challenging the Western narrative on not only the Ukraine situation, but also the West's view of current world geopolitics. As time moves on, the number of other nations supporting his perspective, or at least staying on the sidelines, is gradually building up. Such nations are mostly from outside the West, therefore not part of what Putin has begun to refer to as the Golden Billion. On the 27th of January 2021, Vladimir Putin gave a speech to the WEF Davos Forum. The voiceover here is read from the Russia briefing transcript. Putin is asked, by Klaus Schwab, how do you see the future of European-Russian relations? Putin concludes,
Europe and Russia are absolutely natural partners. From the point of view of the economy, research, technology, and spatial development for European culture, since Russia, being a country of European culture, is a little larger than the entire EU in terms of territory. Russia's resources and human potential are enormous. I will not go over everything that is positive in Europe, which can also benefit the Russian Federation. Only one thing matters: we need to approach the dialogue with each other honestly. We need to discard the phobias of the past, stop using the problems that we inherited from past centuries in internal political processes, and look to the future. If we can rise above these problems of the past, and get rid of these phobias, then we will certainly enjoy a positive stage in our relations. We are ready for this, we want this, and we will strive to make this happen. But love is impossible if it is declared only by one side.
It seems that no one in the West was listening. Only 13 months later, the Russian Federation officially recognized the Donetsk and Lugansk republics, as noted in a speech by Putin on the 21st of February 2022. 3 days later, on the 24th of February 2022, he made his accusatory Empire of Lies speech, as the Russian Federation's special operation began in Ukraine.
Citizens of Russia, friends. I consider it necessary today to speak again about the tragic events in Donbass, and the key aspects of ensuring the security of Russia. I will begin with what I said in my address on February 21, 2022. I spoke about our biggest concerns and worries, and about the fundamental threats which irresponsible Western politicians created for Russia, consistently, rudely and unceremoniously, from year to year. I am referring to the eastward expansion of NATO, which is moving its military infrastructure ever closer to the Russian border.
Putin then goes on to discuss the history we already covered in episode 5, putting great weight on the lies which were used to invade Iraq.
Overall, it appears that nearly everywhere, in many regions of the world where the United States brought its law and order, this created bloody, non-healing wounds, and the curse of international terrorism and extremism. I have only mentioned the most glaring but far from only examples of disregard for international law. This array includes promises not to expand NATO eastwards even by an inch. To reiterate, they have deceived us. Or, to put it simply, they have played us. Sure, one often hears that politics is a dirty business. It could be, but it shouldn't be as dirty as it is now, not to such an extent. This type of con artist behavior is contrary, not only to the principles of international relations, but also and above all to the generally accepted norms of morality and ethics. Where is justice and truth here? Just lies and hypocrisy all around. Incidentally, US politicians, political scientists and journalists write and say that a veritable empire of lies has been created inside the United States in recent years. It is hard to disagree with this. It is really so. But one should not be modest about it. The United States is still a great country and a system-forming power. All its satellites not only humbly and obediently say yes to, and parrot it at the slightest pretext, but also imitate its behavior and enthusiastically accept the rules it is offering them. Therefore, one can say, with good reason and confidence, that the whole so-called Western Bloc, formed by the United States in its own image and likeness, is, in its entirety, the very same empire of lies.
Vladimir Putin again spoke bluntly, several months into the armed conflict in Ukraine, at the SPIEF conference in St. Petersburg, on the 18th of June 2022.
After declaring victory in the Cold War, the United States proclaimed itself to be God's messenger on earth, without any obligations and only interests, which were declared sacred. They seem to ignore the fact that in the past decades, new, powerful and increasingly assertive centers have been formed. Each of them develops its own political system and public institutions, according to its own model of economic growth and, naturally, has the right to protect them, and to secure national sovereignty. However, the ruling elite of some Western states seem to be harboring this kind of illusion. They refuse to notice obvious things, stubbornly clinging to the shadows of the past. For example, they seem to believe that the dominance of the West in global politics, and the economy, is an unchanging, eternal value. Nothing lasts forever. Our colleagues are not just denying reality. More than that, they are trying to reverse the course of history. They seem to think in terms of the past century. They are still influenced by their own misconceptions about countries outside the so-called golden billion. They consider everything a backwater, or their backyard. They still treat them like colonies, and the people living there, like second-class people, because they consider themselves exceptional. If they are exceptional, that means everyone else is second-rate. Thereby, the irrepressible urge to punish, to economically crush anyone who does not fit with the mainstream, does not want to blindly obey. Moreover, they crudely and shamelessly impose their ethics, their views on culture and ideas about history, sometimes questioning the sovereignty and integrity of states, and threatening their very existence. Suffice it to recall what happened in Yugoslavia, Syria, Libya, and Iraq. If some rebel state cannot be suppressed or pacified, they try to isolate that state, or cancel it, to use their modern term. Everything goes, even sports, the Olympics, bans on culture and art masterpieces, just because their creators come from the wrong country. This is the nature of the current round of Russophobia in the West, and the insane sanctions against Russia. They are crazy and, I would say, thoughtless. They are unprecedented in the number of them, and the pace the West churns them out at. The idea was clear as day. They expected to suddenly and violently crush the Russian economy, to hit Russia's industry, finance, and people's living standards, by destroying business chains, forcibly recalling Western companies from the Russian market, and freezing Russian assets. This did not work. Obviously. It did not work out, it did not happen.
On the 7th of July 2022, Putin made another blunt speech, saying, Russia hasn't really even started anything yet.
We hear some people say that we started the war in Donbass, in Ukraine. No, the war was unleashed by the collective West, which organized and supported the unconstitutional armed coup in Ukraine in 2014, and then encouraged and justified genocide against the people of Donbass. The collective West is the direct instigator, and the culprit, of what is happening today. If the West wanted to provoke a conflict in order to move on to a new stage in the fight against Russia, and a new stage in containing our country, we can say that it has succeeded to a certain extent. A war was unleashed, and the sanctions were imposed. Under normal circumstances, it would probably be difficult to accomplish this. But here is what I would like to make clear. They should have realized that they would lose from the very beginning of our special military operation, because this operation also means the beginning of a radical breakdown of the US-style world order. This is the beginning of the transition from liberal globalist American egocentrism, to a truly multipolar world, based not on self-serving rules made up by someone for their own needs, behind which there is nothing but striving for hegemony, not on hypocritical double standards, but on international law, and the genuine sovereignty of nations and civilizations, on their will to live their historical destiny, with their own values and traditions, and to align cooperation on the basis of democracy, justice and equality. Everyone should understand that this process cannot be stopped. The course of history is inexorable, and the collective West's attempts to impose its new world order on the rest of the world, are doomed.
One last quote from Putin, also from his speech on the 7th of July 2022, when he alluded to the arbitrary detention of Julian Assange. See the rulings of the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, listed in Part 6 of this series.
The West, which once declared such principles of democracy as freedom of speech, pluralism, and respect for dissenting opinions, has now degenerated into the opposite, totalitarianism. This includes censorship, media bans, and the arbitrary treatment of journalists, and public figures. These kinds of prohibitions have been extended not only to the information space, but also to politics, culture, education, and art, to all spheres of public life in the Western countries. And, they are imposing this on the world. They are trying to impose this model, a model of totalitarian liberalism, including the notorious cancel culture of widespread bans. However, the truth and reality is that the people in most of these countries do not want this life or this future, and really do not want the formal semblance of sovereignty. They want substantive, real sovereignty and are simply tired of kneeling, of humiliating themselves before those who consider themselves exceptional, and of serving their interests, even to their own detriment. Today we hear that they want to defeat us on the battlefield. Well, what can I say? Let them try. We have already heard a lot about the West wanting to fight us, quote, to the last Ukrainian, unquote. This is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but that seems to be where it is going. But everyone should know that, by and large, we have not started anything in earnest yet. At the same time, we are not rejecting peace talks, but those who are rejecting them should know that the longer it goes on, the harder it will be for them to negotiate with us.
Oddly enough, much of what Putin has said in these speeches chimes with some of what presidential candidate Donald Trump said at an October 2016 rally, just prior to his election. Trump first mentioned WikiLeaks and the role of the corrupt media. Remember that Julian Assange was later indicted under the Trump administration.
This election will determine whether we're a free nation or whether we have only the illusion of democracy, but are in fact controlled by a small handful of global special interests rigging the system, and our system is rigged. This is reality. You know it, they know it, I know it, and pretty much the whole world knows it. The Clinton machine is at the center of this power structure. We've seen this firsthand in the WikiLeaks documents, in which Hillary Clinton meets in secret with international banks to plot the destruction of U.S. sovereignty in order to enrich these global financial powers, her special interest friends, and her donors. Honestly, she should be locked up. The most powerful weapon deployed by the Clintons is the corporate media, the press. Let's be clear on one thing. The corporate media in our country is no longer involved in journalism. They're a political special interest, no different than any lobbyist or other financial entity with a total political agenda, and the agenda is not for you, it's for themselves. Anyone who challenges their control is deemed a sexist, a racist, a xenophobe. They will lie, and then again, they will do worse than that. They will do whatever's necessary. The Clintons are criminals, remember that. This is well documented, and the establishment that protects them has engaged in a massive cover-up of widespread criminal activity at the State Department and the Clinton Foundation in order to keep the Clintons in power.
Candidate Trump then went on to look at the Washington, D.C. power bloc in a way that Putin has now, 6 years later, reflected in his most recent speeches. Trump referred to it as a corrupt establishment and a corrupt machine. Was he alluding to President Eisenhower's final speech warning about the military-industrial complex? Trump concluded that, our great civilization has come upon a moment of reckoning. How can we reconcile Trump's 2016 speech with the fact that it was Trump's administration that indicted Julian Assange on the 6th of March 2018, although, of course, Julian was arbitrarily detained for many years before that, under the Obama administration? I don't have an answer for that question. But I think about it a lot. On the 21st of May 2022, Australians voted in a new federal government, with a new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Based on his signature on a petition, and a few lukewarm words prior to the election, some supporters of Assange held out great hope that he would turn the tide on Australia's neglect of Julian Assange, one of Australia's greatest sons. They hoped the new government would advocate forcefully with the UK, and especially the US, for Julian's release and the dropping of the charges. However, Oscar Granfell writes, on the 7th of July 2022,
"It is hardly a mystery why Labor refuses to defend Assange. The primary focus of the new government has been a foreign policy blitz, orchestrated in the closest of collaboration with the Biden administration, which is seeking Assange's extradition. Wong and Albanese have been on one foreign visit after another, seeking to shore up US dominance in the Indo-Pacific, and to further American imperialism's confrontation with China, which threatens nuclear war. The high point came last week, when Albanese attended the NATO summit in Madrid. There, He gave full support to a new NATO doctrine, which labels Russia and China as threats and calls on member states to prepare for high-intensity, multi-domain warfighting against nuclear-armed peer competitors. The persecution of Assange is retribution for his exposure of past war crimes. But it is also a preparation for new, and even greater crimes, associated with these US-led plans for what is nothing short of a global war. The aim is to intimidate the mass anti-war sentiment that exists among workers and young people, and to establish a precedent for further frame-ups and victimizations. The Labour government is fully committed to Washington's war measures, so it is hostile to Assange.
Plus Assange. Congruent aims. In his address of the 24th of February 2022, speaking of the Russian Federation's special military operation in Ukraine, then just begun, Putin announced the aims of that operation, or war, as it is called in the West.
The purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime. To this end, we will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as well as bring to trial those who perpetrated numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including against citizens of the Russian Federation.
These aims sound very sane to me, especially if adapted and applied to the whole world. They are also congruent with aims that Julian Assange, and other peace-loving people, have already expressed. Firstly, protect people. People such as those in Yemen, who have been subjected to ongoing war in their own land, decimating their health, lives, homes, community infrastructure and environment, over many years. Secondly, demilitarization. Demilitarization, or at least a downsizing of arsenals, has been a shared aim before, at least in terms of attack forces and equipment, as opposed to national defense. Update: Scott Ritter, a former US weapons inspector, recently gave a very powerful interview on this topic that I would highly recommend. Apart from all the physical and mental harm done to humans in war, and through fear of war, the military, and especially the US military, are the biggest polluters of the environment on the planet. Ironically, a fair amount of demilitarization has already been caused in Europe, and even the US, by the Ukraine situation, as it seems that much of the armament stockpile in those countries has already been sent to Ukraine, where most has been destroyed or captured by the Russians. Let's resolve not to feed the coffers of the armaments industry by replacing it. Thirdly, denazification. Denazification is only superficially the removal of those sworn to the Nazi Party, or its modern equivalents, often bearing the symbols of that loyalty on their person or even etched on their bodies. It is more importantly the ridding of our institutions and political leadership of attitudes about the worthlessness of the other. Whether Jew, a particular race, or even the unjabbed. And of ridding them of those who behave as little Eichmanns, or big Eichmanns. Some serious rethinking must go on everywhere, about what good leadership, and good citizenship, really means. And this is not achieved via propaganda. We need to rethink our educational institutions, and employment laws, as well. And then there are the criminal trials, also mentioned in Putin's list of aims. Criminal trials, for all those still living, some of whom have been named in this missive, who have perpetrated serious abuses, especially war crimes, and crimes against humanity, would also be a good thing in my view. Televise such trials, and show them in every country of the world. China's Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Wang Wenbin, echoed Martha Gellhorn's earlier call for a deep inquiry into US warmongering practices, when he said, on the 18th of July 2022.
What these reports uncover is simply shocking and outrageous. It reminds me of the earlier revelations of the killing of Afghan civilians by US and Australian troops. US and its allies' atrocious abuses of human rights that challenge human conscience are not isolated cases. They are persistent, systemic and prevalent recurrences. According to reports, Between 2003 and 2008, thousands of Iraqi civilians were abused by British soldiers in ways such as detention, beating, humiliation, sexual assault, and even murder. The U.S.'s track record was even more abhorring. Over the past nearly 20 years, the U.S. launched more than 90,000 airstrikes on countries including Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, claiming as many as 48,000 civilian lives. Farmers harvesting in the fields, children playing on the streets, families fleeing from wars, and villagers hiding inside buildings all became U.S. troops' targets. Worse still, instead of reflecting on their atrocities, the UK and the US tried every possible way to deflect the blame. According to media reports, the Overseas Operations Act 2021, introduced by the British Parliament, shields British soldiers who committed torture and other serious crimes overseas, and hampers efforts to hold the perpetrators fully accountable. The British Ministry of Defence claimed to have conducted extensive investigation into British soldiers' acts in Afghanistan and Iraq, but 90% of the alleged war crimes were not looked into. Earlier, the U.S. government sanctioned ICC officials who had been investigating war crimes allegedly committed by U.S. troops in the war in Afghanistan. These are the facts. Those who were most vocal about defending human rights have turned out to be the deadliest murderers of innocent civilians, and those most fervently attacking other countries' human rights conditions are the ones who should be put in the dock on human rights. There should be a thorough international investigation into the UK's and US's war crimes and human rights violations. Let justice be done for the innocent victims and protect people all over the world from more bullying and cruelty.
As a journalist from an earlier epoch, a friend of Roosevelt, and unfortunately, now a reviled writer, famously said, "Just so." Julian Assange, advocate for peace and justice. In the previous episode, Martha Gilhorn mourned that governments cannot, or will not, admit mistakes, and therefore apparently don't learn, and don't change. Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks, have already produced more authentic and detailed material on each of two US-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq than has ever before been published. Our historic record, and hence our opportunities to learn from our past, have never been greater. And yet the legacy Western media continues to perpetuate falsehoods and myth, just as they did about the collateral murder events, before WikiLeaks exposed the truth. Sadly, as Assange himself noted, speaking during the press conference, on the 23rd of October 2010, on the release of the Iraq war logs, the first casualty of war is the truth.
Yesterday, the website WikiLeaks released nearly 400,000 classified military documents on the Iraq War. They reportedly revealed details on thousands of previously unreported civilian deaths and alleged torture against detainees by Iraqi authorities. Its founder was among a panel who spoke at a news conference in London to talk about his group's findings.
Thank you, Gavin. Because we don't have much time, I won't speak for long. But this disclosure is about the truth. Philip Knightley, the great investigative reporter, an Australian who for the past 30 or 40 years has made the UK his home, said that the first casualty of war is the truth. But the attack on the truth by war begins long before war starts and continues long after a war ends. In our release of these 400,000 documents about the Iraq War, the intimate detail of that war from the US perspective, we hope to correct some of that attack on the truth that occurred before the war, during the war, and which has continued on since the war officially concluded. In that material, the deaths of some 109,000 people are documented. Internally declared, 66,000 civilians. Working with the Iraq body count, we have seen that there are approximately 15,000 never previously documented or known cases of civilians who have been killed by violence in Iraq. That tremendous scale should not make us blind to the small human scale that occurs in this material. In fact, it is the deaths of 1 and 2 people per event that killed the overwhelming number of people in Iraq.
Julian Assange went on to say, on RT, on the 2nd of May 2011, but now censored by YouTube. Our number one enemy is ignorance. And I believe that is the number one enemy for everyone. It's not understanding what actually is going on in the world. It's only when you start to understand that you can make effective decisions and effective plans. Now, the question is, who is promoting ignorance? Well, those organizations that try to keep things secret, and those organizations which distort true information to make it false or misrepresentative. In this latter category, it is bad media. It really is my opinion that media, in general, are so bad that we have to question whether the world wouldn't be better off without them altogether. They are so distortive to how the world actually is, that the result is that we see wars, and we see corrupt governments, continue on. He continues.
One of the hopeful things that I've discovered is that nearly every war that has started in the past 50 years has been a result of media lies. The media could have stopped it if they had searched deep enough, if they hadn't reprinted government propaganda, they could have stopped it. But what does that mean? Well, that means basically populations don't like wars. And populations have to be fooled into wars. Populations don't willingly and with open eyes go into a war. So if we have a good media environment, then we'll also have a peaceful environment.